Today we'll be discussing how to identify different sets of angle pairs. The first type of angle pair is where you have two adjacent angles. These are angles that share a side. For example, these would be adjacent angles because they share this side here. These would not be adjacent angles because they don't share a side. Complementary angles are angles whose sum is 90 degrees. So if I have a 90-degree angle, angle 1 and angle 2 are complementary. Supplementary angles are angles whose sum is 180 degrees. That means that they form a straight line. So if you have two or more angles that form a straight line, they're supplementary. For example, these are supplementary. If I add even more angles, they still make this 180-degree arc. So for this picture, these are all supplementary angles. 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. These all equal 180 degrees. So they're supplementary. Vertical angles are angles whose sides are opposite rays. So in this picture, these would be opposite angles. And so they're called vertical angles. These two, top and bottom, are also vertical angles. You'll notice that vertical does not refer to the orientation of the angles. So when you look at it, even though these two are connected horizontally, we still call them vertical angles, just like we call these two angles. A linear pair is any two angles that form a straight line, which means that they are supplementary. These two angles, for example, if I took these two sides here and I put them together, I'd get a straight line. So these are a linear pair. For example, this could be 30 and 150. Together they make 180 degrees. And any two angles that make 180 degrees we call a linear pair. These are the three things that you can conclude from an unmarked diagram. So without having to have any markings, you can always assume these things would be true. If you see adjacent angles, you know that they're adjacent. If you see angles that make a straight line, you can assume they're supplementary. If you have two angles which are formed like this, you can always assume that these two angles are vertical and that these two angles are vertical. In the picture I have here, you can see that this adjacent pair here, you can assume they're adjacent and supplementary because they form that straight line. You cannot conclude that angles and segments are congruent. For example, in this picture, it might appear that the two segments are equal, but there are no markings telling you that they are. You also can't assume that an angle is 90 degrees because it could be very close and just appear to be 90. You also can't assume that angles are complementary or supplementary. For example, you can't assume if those are drawn like that they're supplementary. You would need to see some numbers in order to conclude that they are. Okay. They could be, for example, just very close, and not add up to be 180. In this picture, let's name some of the different things. So, for example, we have adjacent angles. Adjacent angles in this picture could be angle BQC and angle BQA. And when I show you with the highlighter, BQC is this angle and BQA is this angle. They share BQ, and so they're adjacent. There are several sets of vertical angles. One of them is EQD and AQC. The other would be CQD and AQE. I'm going to write just one of them. I'm going to write down the left and right one as my answer. Angle AQE and angle CQD. For supplementary angles, I need angles that will add up to be a straight line. So here's a straight line. We can use 2 or 3 angles to describe that. I'm just going to use 2. I'm going to use AQE and AQC. They form this straight line. AQE, AQC. Complementary angles form 90 degrees. So if I had a picture where there was a 90-degree angle drawn in, then I could use, for example, here, AQB and BQC. They would make that 90-degree angle. They would be complementary. Angle AQB, angle AQC. And for a linear pair, we need angles that will form a straight line. Now if you look here, we could use these 2 angles. They're a linear pair. They form that line. So I'm going to write them down. Angle EQD and angle DQC. Sometimes you'll get a problem about a linear pair, and maybe the problem tells you that you have 2 angles that are a linear pair. Then you know they're supplementary. If you remember from before, supplementary means that they add up to be 180 degrees. So if we add them together, we'll subtract 60. Divide by 6. Now if I want to find out what each angle is, I have to take my x and I have to plug it back in. So for example, 2 times 20 is 40 plus 24 is 64. 4 times 20 is 80 plus 36 is 116. And the way to check to see if you did it right is to see if 64 and 116 add up to be 180. Along similar lines, the problem might ask you about complementary angles, and this is where the 2 angles add up to be 90. So we can solve this problem by combining like terms, dividing by 9, and then plugging back in. That would give me 30 and 60. And you'll notice that these 2 numbers add up to be 90. Here's a cool trick. If you haven't learned your 9 times tables yet, you'll notice that down the tens column here, it adds 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And the pattern repeats but goes backwards on the other side. So it's kind of a quick way to learn your 9 times tables.